Tampa, Florida, in the early 1980s, was a place where the good life supposedly got better every day. But for some residents, especially in the summer of 1983, this slogan might seem almost cynical today. A danger loomed in the city that would only be fully understood decades later, long after it was too late for some of Tampa's residents. 19-year-old Barbara Grams was murdered in 1983. She worked at Tampa Bay Mall in a fast food restaurant called Hot Potato and lived with 3 men and another woman in Riverside Heights. On August 19th, after her late shift, she decided to walk home, declining a ride from a roommate. Tragically, she never made it back to her apartment. The next morning, a dentist arriving at work found Barbara's body behind his practice. She had suffered a fatal blow to the face. Her upper body was exposed, and there were signs of sexual assault. Her purse was nearby, its contents emptied, and a ring was missing. The police concluded it was a robbery gone wrong, and the search for her killer began. Barbara's injuries were so severe that her family was advised not to view her body. However, a promising lead emerged, a bite mark on her left cheekbone. The police collected dental impressions from her acquaintances and also found hair on her body, but weeks passed without any success in identifying a suspect. Robert DuBoise, 18 at the time, lived with his family in Seminole Heights. He had dropped out of school and worked at an auto repair shop to support his family, who had faced numerous hardships. Robert spent his free time with friends, some of whom were known troublemakers. A few minor run-ins with the law put him on the police's radar, and he lived near where Barbara's body was found. Robert's first police interview occurred under odd circumstances. A police officer recognized him in a parking lot and asked him to provide a dental impression, which Robert agreed to. Afterward, he noticed that the police began questioning people at places he often visited. On October 21st, 1983, Robert planned to meet a woman named Josie, hoping to get closer to her. He even rented a motel room. What he didn't know was that Josie was acting as a decoy, helping the police set him up as a suspect in Barbara's murder. The dental impression Robert gave was analyzed, and a dentist concluded it matched the bite mark on Barbara's cheek. On the night of October 21st, Robert and Josie went to some bars, and later they headed to the motel. Shortly after they arrived, the police knocked on the door. The police told Robert his mother was in trouble and that he needed to come with them. Worried, he agreed, only to find himself in handcuffs minutes later, charged with murder. Despite his protests, Robert was taken to the police station, where he was given a sedative without explanation. When Robert finally appeared before a judge, he was formally charged with first-degree murder, though Barbara Graham's name wasn't mentioned. Robert was desperate to prove his innocence and even passed a lie detector test, but the charges remained, leading to his trial in 1985. At 20, Robert faced trial after spending 16 months in pretrial detention. He hoped to clear his name but was disheartened when he first heard the word death penalty. The prosecution focused on the bite mark as key evidence, despite the fact that the hair found on Barbara's body didn't match Robert's. The dentist who testified against Robert had previously worked on the Ted Bundy case. In Robert's case, however, the dentist had to rely on photos of the bite mark rather than the original wound. Nonetheless, he testified that the mark matched Robert's dental impression. Witnesses also testified against Robert, including a motel guest who claimed Robert had boasted about being wanted for murder, and Josie, who said Robert often talked about violence and had scratches on his body. An inmate named Claude Butler also claimed Robert had confessed to the murder while in custody. Despite Robert's denials, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and attempted sexual assault. The prosecution sought the death penalty, and Robert was sentenced to death. Robert spent 37 years in prison, including several on death row. His family's visits dwindled as they moved on with their lives. His father passed away, and his siblings started their own families. In his early 40s, Robert began a relationship with a prison employee named Lourdes Sanchez, who believed in his innocence. They eventually got engaged, but the relationship ended when Robert's hopes for a new trial were dashed. In 2007, Robert's first parole request was denied, and he was told he wouldn't be eligible for another hearing until 2094. Adding to his despair, most of the evidence from his case had been destroyed, making it nearly impossible to prove his innocence. Despite this, Robert continued writing letters to anyone who might listen, hoping someone would take up his case. Finally, in 2020, the Innocence Project responded. The Innocence Project of Florida took on Robert's case in February 2020, providing him with lawyer Susan Friedman. She focused on the bite mark evidence that had been crucial to Robert's conviction, citing studies showing that such evidence is highly unreliable. Susan's arguments convinced authorities to reopen the case. During the review, a forgotten DNA sample from Barbara's body was discovered. In August 2020, this DNA was tested and did not match Robert, his brother, or his friend. Instead, it matched two other men, Amos Robinson and Abron Scott, who were already in prison for another murder. The DNA evidence cleared Robert, and in the summer of 2020, he was finally released after 37 years behind bars. The summer Barbara was murdered later became known as the Summer of Hell in Tampa. Between July and October 1983, 8 women were found dead, their bodies discovered in public places or behind buildings. The police didn't initially link the cases, and many remained unsolved. When the DNA from Barbara's case was reanalyzed in 2020, it linked Robinson and Scott to another unsolved murder from that summer, the killing of Linda Lanson. In 2022, after 2 years of freedom, Robert learned that Abron Scott had confessed to the murder of Barbara Grams. His confession, coupled with the DNA evidence, finally exonerated Robert. Even Claude Butler, the inmate whose testimony had been crucial in Robert's conviction, recanted his statement, admitting that he had lied to reduce his sentence. When Robert DuBoise was released in 2020, he was 55 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in prison, and his dreams of a normal life were shattered. After his release, he took on odd jobs as a handyman, valuing his freedom above all else. In 2023, Robert was awarded $1.85 million in compensation, though the sum could never make up for the life he lost. Despite the hardship, Robert harbors no bitterness and remains focused on living peacefully. In January 2024, he received another compensation payment and bought a house with the money. Though nearing 60, Robert hasn't given up on his dream of starting a family. He hopes to adopt children or teenagers and give them the home he never had. Even after all these years, Robert continues to work as a handyman and takes care of his elderly mother, choosing to live without anger and focusing on the possibility of creating a family of his own.